because she's experienced it. And therefore, her interaction with other research participants will have a different quality compared to someone who didn't have any of that experience. Not that it would be better, necessarily, but it would be different. So it's important for her to acknowledge, this is my position, this is how it's going to influence the research, and I'm aware of it, and this is how I'm going to work with it. Right. So that would be acceptable within an interpretivist paradigm, if I can use that word, whereas it wouldn't within, say, a positivist or post-positivist paradigm. So it depends on your assumptions about research and knowledge and so on. Okay, does that answer? Okay, right.
If I can perhaps attempt. I think this really is quite an interesting one, because it's this kind of the interface between the paradigms is where we're sitting.
Yes.
And in management generally, the dominant paradigm has been a positivist one, surveys, objectivity of the researcher and what have you. However, I think that is changing to some degree, and because it's still early days, I think there are many who would say that in fact you want to remove the researcher from the research.
Yes.
But if I think of the number of proposals that we've had, where the person comes in and says, I'm doing this proposal, I'm doing this particular research because I'm working in this very specific area. There is, of course, the literature and the theories that are there, but I'm actually there, and so my experience is actually very valuable. And I think we wouldn't want to downplay that by saying, oh, no, we don't want your personal. In fact, that's what makes it rich, yes, rather than just relying on a kind of theoretical study. So even in a quantitative study, I think there's a place for that personal interest and experience, because otherwise, if you're just doing a kind of thing that you're not interested in, it would be very dull. So there are a whole lot of shades of kind of involvement, I guess, of the researcher. In the quantitative one, I think we would want to have that interest and what have you there. It's not as heightened, perhaps, as saying, I'm going to tell my story and it's a narrative research. We haven't got quite there yet. But I think more and more there's recognition of the role of the researcher and, in fact, your position. So, for instance, if someone's working in an organization and they're a highly financially sensitive topic, and they want to do some research there, the fact that they're in that place is the only way they'll be able to do that research. If someone else can be outside, they're going to just say, you're not even in the game. So there's sort of ways in which it's an advantage to have a kind of personal, a strongly personal interest and basing it on your experience as well. Yes. It's a very lot of words about a very little. Apologies for that.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. I think that helps a lot. So, if you're doing this kind of research, it is important to almost declare your position and to think about what are the advantages, but also what are the potential disadvantages. So sometimes a person who has this kind of experience would have very strong views about it, and then there's a danger of him or her imposing those views and simply confirming what she already thinks or believes. So then you have to think about, okay, how am I going to deal with that? And it might be that she'll see herself and other people's voices separate from her and standing, she's standing as one among other participants who have equal kind of say in their experience. To talk about your position. Okay, in your kind of, what you're doing, it might be unwise to do that, so you have to decide. But generally, if we just go back, those first two lines of argument, the importance of the issue and the gap in the literature are very important to acknowledge. But I'm looking at it, I'm building on what they've done, and perhaps bringing in a new perspective, or perhaps doing it in a new way. So you might say my study takes a topic from the literature but addresses it from a different perspective or in a different way. Okay. And then a third line of argument might be that you're doing something that other people haven't done. So you might say that there's a lot of literature on this topic and that topic, but not on the topic that I've chosen. And therefore, I'm addressing a gap in the literature, and in that way I'm contributing. So, the line of argument depends on your topic and on the state of the literature. and you'll be able to know better which line of argument is appropriate. Okay. Now, I think a typical failing within chapters literature reviews is that students would go through the literature and describe what people have said in the literature, but they wouldn't really build an argument for their own study. So that stage of going through the literature and kind of recounting what people have said, that's really only the first step in a literature review. From there, you have to look at what are the themes, the cross-cutting themes, and synthesize and organize that literature. And then the next step is to say, okay, now how can I build my argument from that? So we have to go beyond simply listing authors and describing what they say, to thematizing and synthesizing, and then to making an argument for our study. If you're able to do that, then the literature becomes a very powerful tool and one of the strong lines of argument through your study. Okay. Does that make sense? It's hard to do, but that's really what we're looking for. So I was just saying yesterday, I'm marking a PhD at the moment, and the student actually almost lists authors and says, one author per paragraph. Right? So so-and-so says this, blah, 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 blah. So-and-so says this. And it might be the same thing that they're saying, or it might be slightly different. But they haven't gone, the next step is saying, okay, how do I pull them together? And rather than organizing it by author, organize it by theme, and pull the authors together around that theme. Okay? So that would be a more kind of sophisticated way of doing it. And then from that to say, how does it link to my topic? Right? So this literature links to my topic in this way. Right? It might give you a foundation for your study. It might show a gap for your study. It might give you some ideas about how to go about your study. Okay. Does it? Yes? Okay.
So when would you actually position that argument? Would it be after you've done the synthesis of the authors and then sort of at the concluding?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I think there's different ways of doing it, and I think it would depend on your particular chapter and your style. And I think either of those ways could be. So you might start building your argument in each section of your literature review, saying how that section relates to your study, or you might kind of pull them all together at the end and sort of build a consolidated argument. So it just depends on your approach and what will work for you. But it is important to keep on making links to your topic as you're going through the literature, because that's why you're doing the literature review. You're situating your study in this wider field of scholarship and trying to link it and connect it to show how your study fits in. Okay. Yes?
So it would be all right to use the, this author said this and that author said that kind of approach if they were like two authors that had opposite opinions,
yes.
And then you were trying to say, well, I'm taking this person's view, or I'm not taking either of those views, I'm taking a third view.
Yes.
It is okay to do that, but it's not okay to sort of say, author 1 says this, author 2 says that, author 3 says that, and
yes.
you list 20 authors,
yeah.
and you just get tired.
Yes, yes. So if you mobilizing your literature review to support an argument, that's really what's important. Okay. So there's no problem with referring to authors, but it's about how you connect that into your review and into building the argument that you're making in the literature review. Okay. And in fact, that can be great to say, you might say, my study is about learning organizations, for example, and there's a number of views about the importance of learning organizations. This group of authors argues this group argues that, this is my position. So that would be great. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, did you want to say that?
Yeah, I've asked and you've answered, but back to this notion of scholarship. Scholarship is not just what you find in journals.
Yes,
Scholarship is also policy, public policy,
yes,
it's regulation, it's interpretation,
yes.
it's mood, and our understanding thereof.
Yes.
So, and not necessarily from an interpretivist background, but what we saddle with here, and the public admin people, I think, come from this perspective. We saddle with what might be 400-year-old ideological practice sifted through 100 years of party ideology and 50 years of charter and 20 years of constitution
Yes.
and 18 years of policy. That is scholarship, but it's not prepared by scholars.
Yes, yes.
That's
Yeah.
acceptable?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a really important view, especially in, you mentioned disciplines which aren't necessarily, maybe they don't have the same kind of history or whatever, or they're developing in different ways. So, for example, I've got a student who's working in the area of public health, and in a way, it's quite a new discipline because it's bringing together, medicine and public administration and human resources and sociology and so on. So it's a kind of emerging discipline, and there is a lot of there's policy stuff, there's practice, and then there's these different disciplines. So the scholarship is diverse, and it's not just about journal articles, absolutely. It's also about policy, and it's also about traditions of knowledge that have been carried forward. So I really like your approach of having a broad understanding of scholarship. Scholarship might not even be written necessarily, especially in an African context where you have indigenous forms of knowledge. If you're doing a study on literature, the scholarship is not necessarily written. So it's important just to think about that as well. Yeah. Good. Thanks for that point. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to establish the relationship between the position you will be taking in terms of arguing based on the literature
Yes.
and the research objectives.
Yes.
I understand that the rationale of the study is supposed to be the guidance of your arguments and the flow thereof
Yes.
the entire thesis.
Yes.
But where do the research objectives come in that picture?
Okay. It's a good question. Thanks for that. Right. So the research objectives would be what you want to achieve through your research. Right. And typically those research objectives would you'd be able to crystallize them in the form of questions. Right? So often you have objectives and then questions that are kind of take the objective and put it into the form of a question. Right? I think the literature review is not answering those questions because you're going to go and collect data and analyze it, and then that will help you to answer the questions. Right? But the literature review is giving you a platform or a foundation for your study. Helping you to build concepts and to find out where the gap is in the literature. Okay? So it's more like giving you scaffolding for doing the task of collecting the data and then actually trying to answer your research questions. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Right. In some cases, the study is a literature review. So some people's whole thesis is a literature review, and in that case, the objectives and the questions would be different. But that's quite unusual. Right. I think typically most of your studies are empirical studies where you have questions, you go out and collect data, analyze it, and then see how you can answer your questions. Is that correct? Okay. Occasionally a student will say, nobody has pulled all the literature together, so my whole study is going to be about the literature. And then the objectives and questions would be according to that, that focus. Okay. But don't worry about that. Okay. Right, so I just want to show you an example of a literature review, just a brief example, just so you can see some of the moves that are being made. And again, it's the student that I was mentioning earlier. So this is a part of her literature review in fact, it's from the proposal. So she says, what are the experiences and challenges faced by adult learners with hidden disabilities in the higher education context? Right. So you can see she's setting up the literature review with a question, which is quite nice because then saying, let's look at what other people have done and what they found out, and then that gives me a reference point for my study. So it says, this question has not been explored in much detail. So you see, creating the gap in the literature. There is a small body of research that focuses particularly on chronic illness as a hidden disability within a higher education context, but it does not concentrate on adult learners in particular. By adult learners, she's defined it as mature learners. Okay. There is research on adult learners in higher education, disabled learners in higher education, disabled adult learners in other education contexts, and people with hidden disabilities, both within and outside the education arena. But very little research has combined all these variables as one area of focus within a South African context. Okay. So do you see how she's saying, this is what the literature says, this is what we have in the literature, this is what's missing, this is the gap that I'm contributing to. You see the kind of move she's making? Okay. So she has to know the literature well to make those kinds of claims. And then she's fitting in her own study into that, into that landscape of literature. Okay. And then she goes on to look at each of those themes and in more detail. So she'd go on to look at adult learners in higher education, disabled learners in higher education, and so on and so on. So it's a kind of a preview of her argument there. So you can say, my argument is that there's a gap in the literature. People have looked at these things separately, but they haven't combined them, and there's a gap in the South African context. Okay. There can be different kinds of gaps in the literature, right? There might be a conceptual gap. Right. So it might be that people haven't used a particular kind of theory to look at a problem. There might also be a methodological gap. So it might be that they haven't used certain kinds of methods. So for example, perhaps in certain parts of management studies, the methods are more like survey and quantitative methods. But there might be a gap in the more qualitative methods. So there could be a methodological gap. And then there could also be a contextual gap. In other words, people have looked at this problem in other countries. We know from reading journals that a lot of the knowledge is created in America and in the North. But we don't have that much in African context. So you might say there's a contextual gap in that people haven't done the study in the South or in South Africa. And then I suppose the fourth kind of gap would be a substantive gap. That is, people haven't looked at this topic at all. So those four gaps, conceptual, methodological, contextual, and substantive. And you can work out which of those, or perhaps maybe it's a combination which might apply to your study. Yes? Okay, so the first one I mentioned was the conceptual gap. Right. So that would be that people haven't used the theory or the ideas in relation to that particular topic. So, as you read the literature, you probably find that people usually use certain kinds of theory to look at the problem that you're interested in. So, I don't know, human capital theory, is that used a lot in management studies? I'm not sure, I don't know the theory, so this is really out of ignorance. But you're probably familiar, there's a certain body of theory that people typically use to look at problems. And then you might say, I'm going to use a different theory because it'll give me a different lens which might reveal new insights. So that would be the first one, conceptual gap. The second one would be a methodological gap. All right, so you're using a new kind of methodological approach. And for example, you might use a qualitative approach which gives you insight into people's experience. And that's different from a quantitative survey which gives you a broad picture but not a deep picture. You see what I mean? So not to say that one's better than the other, but they both have their value. And sometimes, say for example in medicine, most of the research is quantitative. And if you bring in a qualitative lens, sometimes it helps you to get a feeling of how people experience something, and which can be valuable. So that's the methodological. The third one would be a contextual gap. That is, most of the studies are done elsewhere, in Britain, America, Germany, or wherever. And there's very little research in our context. So we need to do research here so we can build our own kind of knowledge. Right, so that would be a contextual gap. And then the fourth one is, I call it a substantive gap. And that is that the topic itself hasn't been researched. Right? So people have looked at this and this and this, but not that. That area, there's just nothing on it. So that would be a substantive gap in the literature. Saying that your literature, or sorry, your study builds on existing literature. So it might be, for example, some of you are doing a replica study. So people have done the study, you're doing it again, but perhaps with a slightly different context or a slightly different focus. So that would be the line of argument, that you're trying to consolidate and develop existing knowledge. And then another line of argument would be that you know, this kind of study hasn't been done in this particular situation. So we were talking about Lesotho and industrial relations, that there might not be that much literature on industrial relations in Lesotho. So that might be a contextual type of gap. And then others are saying there's more like a substantive gap. You're talking about small, medium, and micro enterprises, and saying that there's been quite a lot of work on small and medium, but not that much on